Today is a really important day for this city. Today is a day that we honour one of our sons.
In April 2013, people from all over the world came to Swansea in South Wales to pay tribute to Pete Ham, an unsung hero of British pop music.
Well, today I believe is a long overdue event in Swansea. It's recognising Pete Ham and what he did, not only for Swansea but for the music scene in general.
When we unveil the plaque, we'll honour Peter, but we'll put on record that if you're a kid from Swansea, you can still do something amazing and you can change the world.
Amongst the guests were Pete's partner Anne and his daughter Petera, who grew up in Glasgow without knowing her father.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Peter's daughter, Petera.
It's very emotional for me, especially when I hear the Welsh accents and things. And Petra, as you know, my daughter's unveiling the plaque, which is it's lovely for me, for her to be doing that.
Although I didn't know my dad, I still feel very close to him through all of his music and everything that my mum tells me about him. Many people don't get to hear things about their father after they go. At least I've got his music, and I'm just very, very proud.
This is the story of Pete Ham and his band, Badfinger.
No matter what you are, I will always be with you. Doesn't matter what you do, girl, with you.
In a business where tales of rip-offs and shattered dreams are 10 a penny, the story of Badfinger is the stuff of legend.
This is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, I think.
In their short time together, Badfinger made some truly great music.
Be a part of it all. Nothing to see, nothing to say, nothing to do.
They were, a highly respected band from the masters at that time.
The band's leader and creative driving force was Pete Ham. Together with bandmate Tommy Evans, he wrote the classic Without You.
I can't live if living is without you. I can't.
Many people that I've worked with since, the guys that write songs were very successful. To a man, they will say, wish I'd have written it.
Most of the stories you ever hear about the band really are all pretty sombre, but there was so much good stuff and happiness as well. It wasn't all doom and gloom.
I'm a joker, just a joker. I make people laugh and they see the half that is happy. Are you happy?
He kind of felt as though it was his duty to cheer everyone up, be the joker.
He cared as much for people around him, more so than he did for himself.
The band started out in the mid-1960s. They originally called themselves the Iveys, after Ivy Place in Swansea, where they rehearsed.
Well, Peter was born and brought up on Town Hill in Swansea.
The Swansea scene was it was like Liverpool without the record interest. You could play 7 nights a week, twice on Sunday if you wanted to. The scene just vibrated with energy.
We would play all South Wales down to Pembroke, Pembroke Town, Alfred West, up to Cardiff, Newport, up the valleys. Then the bigger bands would come in and we would support them. We supported the Who,
The Yardbirds, the Mersey Beats,
Moody Blues, Pink Floyd at the Swansea University.
The only ones we didn't actually support were the likes of the Beatles and the Stones, I suppose.
One night in 1966, at the Regal Ballroom, Ammanford, they met the man who had set them on the road to stardom.
We noticed an elderly gentleman with a moustache and a black corduroy jacket stopped in his tracks, turned around and stared at us.
Then he came to the dressing room and said, I like what you do, lads. I really think you're really a good band. You could go far.
Bill Collins became the band's manager and took them to London to live with him in his house in Golders Green.
Before we moved away, he had a meeting with all the parents and said that, you can't promise anything, but you promise hard work and blood, sweat and tears, I think he quoted Churchill.
It was everything that it was purported to be in London at that time. I'm just so glad I was part of it. It was a struggle to start with in the house because there were 2 bands living there. You had the Mojos, which occupied part of it, and we were crammed into the loft. We used to sleep on camp beds in the first, 9 or 12 months we were there.
For 2 years, the band travelled the country, gigging solidly. Whenever they were at home at Golders Green, Pete spent every minute in a makeshift studio Bill had put in the house.
There was a sweat box in there. It was about 10 by 10. It was a soundproof cube. Pete used to spend most of the night, so he did most of his songwriting overnight.
It's incredible what he used to put down. And he used to speed up the guitar solo and then slow it down and play it back, and it sounded like Pinky and Perky, it's always experimenting and looking for something new,
I say down, 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 down.
Literally at the age of 19 and 20, for a year and a half, he created all kinds of mini masterpieces with tons of background vocals, and it's astounding stuff. And no one of that time, of that ilk, was doing anything like what Pete Ham was. But he was doing it alone in this room.
Pete was very shy when I first met him. It was only after I'd known him for a couple of weeks that his sense of humour really came out, which was what drew me to him, really. Pete always found it easier to express his emotions through his music. So if there was a particular situation, maybe we'd had an argument or something, his way of apologising to me or stating his side of the case would be through songs.
The only time I'm lying is when you would want me to.
The hard work was starting to pay off, but there were changes in the air. Di Jenkins was replaced by Tommy Evans from Liverpool, who became Pete's main songwriting partner. Pete was writing about his life and the way the world was changing around him. Knocking Down Our Home was his response to the urban redevelopment of his hometown of Swansea.
They go to west, far away. Seems that our house must go. They go to build a motorway.
The song was one of several demos Bill Collins sent to the Beatles record company Apple. Paul McCartney heard it and loved it, and the Iveys became the first band signed to Apple.
I suppose you could say it was like all our Christmases coming at once. Of all the labels to get offered a record deal with, Apple, come on.
By the late 60s, music and fashion were changing, and Apple felt the band needed a makeover. So the Iveys became Badfinger, named after a Beatles song, Badfinger Boogie. To help them along, Paul McCartney gave them a song he'd written for a film called The Magic Christian.
Make your mind up fast. If you want it anytime, I can give it.
Next thing they knew, they had a top 5 hit single, and they were on top of the pops.
Come and Get It, on top of the pops. I think that was the peak time for Pete and the rest of the members. The smiles, the excitement is just written all over their faces. It's pure ecstasy.
If you want it, here it is. Come and get it.
But one person didn't make it to top of the pops. Ron Griffiths, who'd been with the band from the start and played on Come and Get It, was replaced by Joey Molland.
Well, my demise from the band was simply because I was married and it went against the grain. My little boy, Jason, was in the house. Tommy would put his stereo on at the early hours of the morning and wake the baby up. Maureen, my wife, obviously wasn't best pleased because the baby was being woken up. And it seemed as if I was being edged out, you know. I wasn't happy about going, certainly I wasn't. I came up to live in Hemel Hempstead and I ended up doing a production line job at a firm in Hemel. driving to work on a push bike in the morning, doing a 6 till 2 and a 2 till 10 shift. Well, Come and Get It was in the charts.
Next stop, America.
We picked up the tour bus in New Jersey and we kicked off from New Jersey. It was endless, 500 miles a day sometimes on a Greyhound bus. Pete had his Super 8 camera running the whole time.
So listen to my song all night.
America seeped into Pete's writing and inspired one of his most powerful pieces of social commentary.
Pete had a very strong sense of justice. As he saw it, so many in America had so much, and then there were so many that had virtually nothing. He found it very disturbing and said, there could be a revolution, they must do something. It's up to the youngsters, the people of our age then, to try and turn this around and make the whole thing fairer.
There's no good revolution, just power changing hands. There is no straight solution, set to understand.
First thing people have to do before they try and do anything about the world is admit that they've got a lot of faults themselves and admit that there is no real perfection. People get too obsessed with ideals, the perfect world or the perfect human being, and there's no such thing. So all basically that song says is realize our imperfections and talk about them and then try and do something about it.
The band returned to Britain and went into Abbey Road Studios to record their new album, No Dice. Hidden away at the end of side 1 was a song which would change their fortunes forever.
The boys had been in the studio for quite a few nights, and Pete said, right, I'm not going in the studio tonight, we're going out for the evening. Just literally as we were walking out the front door, Tom popped his head round and said, an idea for a song. You come in the studio, and Pete said, no, I promised Bev we're going out tonight. I said, no, it's fine. And he said, no, I promised you. And I said, look, I don't mind, I'm smiling. And he said, your mouth's smiling, but your eyes are sad.
You always smile, but in your eyes your sorrow shows. Yes, it shows.
As soon as I heard that line, you always smile, but in your eyes your sorrow shows, there were quite a few tears shed.
Pete had got this verse and a chorus that he'd written. Wasn't very happy with the chorus, and Pete and Tommy conversely had the opposite thing. You know, he had this chorus line, wasn't very happy with his verse, and at Pete's suggestion said, why don't we just amalgamate these two bits?
The two songs were joined together, and Without You was born.
A few weeks later, the band were back in the studio. In the room next door, singer Harry Nilsson was recording his own album. He called Badfinger in to listen to his new single.
And they were chuffed to meet this fellow, you know, and Pete did admire him. He loved Harry's solo records that he had done. So he said, would you come in the studio and just listen to this track I'm doing? And they're just sitting there listening, and they're hearing Harry Nilsson covering Without You. And then you can imagine when the chorus came in, everybody struck. I mean, and he sings that big note. They said they were floored. They were pitting themselves against the wall. immediately it became a worldwide sensation. Everybody was covering it. Shirley Bassey, Andy Williams, Engelbert Humperdinck, Frank Sinatra. I mean, everybody was covering it or doing it live.
They achieved the goal of every self-respecting songwriter in that they've wrote a standard, you know, which is, I mean, that's up there with White Christmas, isn't it?
George Harrison took an interest in Badfinger, producing them in the studio and asking them to play on his own records. George was particularly impressed with Pete.
Pete was still quite in awe of George and couldn't quite believe that he was good enough to play with George, even though everyone kept saying to him he would not ask you if he didn't think you were good enough.
I met George Harrison some years later and was having a conversation with him, and he told me how in awe of Pete he was. And Pete never knew that.
George produced songs for Badfinger's next album, including the hit single Day After Day.
I remember finding out about you.
And on one song in particular, a slide guitar thing that Pete had come up with, George was so keen that in the studio he said, look, why don't we just do this together? I mean, this would be great, double tracked, and we could do... So he got really involved, not only in the production, but also sort of playing on the record.
George chose Badfinger to be part of his backing band at the legendary concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden in 1970.
Pete was just so excited. One thing going in the studio with George, but to be on stage with George and for George to have asked him was the highest compliment he could have got from anyone.
By now, Badfinger should have been very comfortably off, but the money was not coming through to the band.
He was changing for the gig and had on what I thought was a pair of, I don't know, comic shoes. The soles were coming away, like the old vaudeville comedians or something like that. And I said, oh, part of the act, do you do a comedy number? He said, no, those are my stage shoes. I said, well, you can't wear those on stage. I said, you know, you're the local idol coming back. He said, they're the only ones I've got.
Badfinger's eccentric manager, Bill Collins, had encouraged the band to put their finances in the hands of an American businessman named Stan Polly.
When the band started to get successful, Bill kind of got out of his depth. He did things that he thought were right for the band, but they weren't.
Now, I believe that Polly meant well, although he's a very astute businessman. He knows all the tricks. And he told us, he said, I know all the tricks, but if you play ball, I'll play ball, and we'll all get along fine, and we'll all finish up millionaires.
He was the archetypal manager with a big cigar, and, you know, I'm going to, you know, take you guys to the stars, you know, all that sort of business. And it seemed okay at first.
Polly's first move was to get Badfinger away from Apple Records and signed up to a new deal he negotiated with Warner Brothers. He dazzled Bill and the band with talk of huge cash advances and said that for tax reasons, the money should be paid into a series of different bank accounts which he himself would control.
He said, we'll just put it all in a pot, and by the time we've reached the end of the album deals, you know, you'll all be very rich people. But in the meantime, we'll just be on a basic salary, I'm afraid, you know, blah, blah, blah. And of course, not knowing any better and wanting to think the best of people, the band went along with it, you know.
Took me all around New York in a big limo, and he said, it's no good to you lady and read this contract, but it's 3 inches thick. But he said, basically, you've got to understand, and he talked and talked and talked and drummed into my mind that we had a $3 million deal to make 6 albums in 3 years. And
this was all worked out in the back of a limousine in New York City?
Yeah, riding around in the dark.
Oh, I'm sorry, but it's time to make a stand. Though we never meant to bite the loving hand.
Pete was a very loyal guy and didn't want to split away from Apple. You know, that was like sort of leaving part of the family again. And I think that was a terrible strain on Pete.
Pete was so grateful to the opportunity they gave him and his band, and he wrote a song called Apple of My Eye. How many artists write a song about their record label? Usually when they're about to leave, they're angry, but that was Pete Ham.
But now the time has come to part.
There were changes too in Pete's personal life. After his relationship with Beverly ended, he had several girlfriends. He was a man who very much needed to be in love. Finally, he got together with Anne, and she soon discovered she was pregnant.
This was heaven for Pete, you know, family man, and suddenly he was going to have his family. And he'd lived for all these years, you know, in essentially a bedsit in Golders Green. I mean, that's what it was, living on very little money, even during all the successes.
Pete set up a home with Anne in Weybridge, Surrey, just a mile down the road from Tommy Evans and his wife, Marianne.
He was just a lovely, lovely guy, beautiful nature. You couldn't have asked for a better partner. He was so kind, loving. He wanted to be left alone to write his music and play his music, but he was... You have to be hard to be in the music business, and Pete was not like that at all.
Pete was very happy, you know. He wanted to do loads of stuff with the house. Everything seemed okay until the checks stopped coming.
The cash advances from Warner Brothers had disappeared. So too had Badfinger's American manager, Stan Polly. Loyal and trusting to the end, Pete refused to believe Polly was ripping them off. Then Warner Brothers sued the band for the return of their money, and Badfinger were effectively shut down by their own record company.
I remember myself, Tommy and Pete going to other management companies in London saying, look, we're in this terrible situation, you know, and we'd really just like to continue our career. We just want to play. And the companies were sort of saying, well, who are you with? And we'd mention the setup, and they'd say, well, you get out of that and then come and see us, you know. We could have almost written all that off if we could have just carried on and, you know, started again. Do you know what I mean? But it was difficult to start again.
Hey, Mr. Manager, you're messing up my life. Hey, Mr. Manager, don't think I need that kind of strife.
Pete felt like he was a big brother. When life got in the way and things happened with Pete, and he took a step back and looked at where his life was going, he thought, I'm letting everybody down.
He'd have a smile on his face, but he'd put cigarette, you know, stubs out on his hand. It was like self-harm. Yeah, I mean, this shows the extent to which he was burning up inside, really. I mean, he felt awful, obviously. And he played me some tapes of new stuff. One song really kind of stuck with me. It was a song called Ringside.
Take your seats by the ringside. Watch them scrapping for your blood.
If you listen to that lyric, it's such a sad thing because he's lightening his situation to, yeah, gather round at the ringside and watch me going down.
I can't bear to feel the sorrow of the evil that you show.
Pete had been making these calls to try and ascertain what was happening at the American end. Could never get through to Polly. But in the end, one guy worked there, Stan Poses, who had a bit more of an empathy with us. He spoke to Pete. And unfortunately, he revealed that he basically said outright that, yeah, Stan Polly isn't very wholesome. He's not a good person. He is ripping you off. He said all the things that Pete didn't want to hear, really.
It was the last straw for Pete. All he'd ever wanted to be was a musician. Now he felt that everything he and the band had worked for had come to nothing. He went to see Tommy.
They went for a few drinks at the pub, drowned their sorrows a little bit, I guess. Tommy drove Pete back to his house, and Pete got out and said, "Don't worry, mate, you know, I've got a plan. I know what to do. I've got a way out of this. Don't worry. Yeah, bye." Later on in the morning, there was this panicky phone call from Anne, and she spoke to Marianne and Tommy and said there's something awful happened, something terrible, terrible. So Tommy rushed round there and found Peter hanging, you know, in the garage.
Pete was just 27 years old. He left a suicide note which read, "I will not be allowed to love and trust everybody. This is better. P.S. Stan Polly is a soulless bastard. I will take him with me." Anne returned to her hometown of Glasgow, and 5 weeks after Pete's death, she gave birth to their daughter, who she called Petera.
People had said to me after, "It's terrible what he did, and that leaving you with a baby and everything." I could never say that. I wish I could, but I could never say that about Pete. And I know that he wasn't himself when he did that. The doctor had explained to me that his mind had probably just gone.
I understand that Polly, who'd actually taken life assurances out on everyone, was trying to cash in a policy on Pete, you know, even after this terrible event, was still trying to make money on it somehow, you know.
Meanwhile, Pete's bandmate and best friend Tommy Evans was slowly falling apart.
When he died, Tommy didn't have anybody he can talk to, write songs. His other half was gone, so he felt lost and lonely. Many times he said, "I want to be there where he is." Everything went wrong for Tommy as well. Tax problem, taxman after him. Somebody sued me for 5 million. So everything just collapsed.
Tom tried really hard after Pete died. He kind of tried to make it work, not just for him, but for Pete. But they got setback after setback.
8 years after Pete's death, Tommy also hanged himself.
I was angry with Tommy when he took his life. Too many people had gone through enough with Peter's death. Because you don't tend to bury friends before you're 30. One's bad enough. Two's too many.
It all happened a long time ago. But for those who lived through it, the story of Badfinger, the friendships and the music live on.
No matter what you do.
Now it's time for a new chapter to be written. On the 20th of August 2013, Petera gave birth to Pete's first grandchild, who she called Luca William Ham.
No matter what you are.
Promising to bring world-class motor racing to Ebbw Vale, will the Circuit of Wales deliver all that's promised? Week in, week out investigates tomorrow at 10:35.